In the early 2008, 24-year-old Lindsay Buziak was working as a real estate agent in Victoria, British Columbia. She was still relatively early in her career, but had already made a promising start. At the time, she was dating Jason Zalo, whose family was also involved in real estate. Near the end of January, Lindsay received a call on her personal cell phone from a woman looking for a home. She said that she and her husband wanted to buy quickly and had a budget of around $1 million. The woman spoke with a strange foreign accent and gave Lindsay a name that would later turn out to be fake. Lindsay was also confused about how she had gotten her personal number, but the caller claimed that one of Lindsay's former clients had given it to her. Lindsay told Jason and her father about the call because something about it had made her uncomfortable. Still, there was nothing that clearly showed the woman wasn't a legitimate buyer, and $1 million sale would mean a significant commission. Jason encouraged Lindsay to take the appointment and offered to stay nearby while she showed the house. Lindsay eventually found a suitable property and scheduled the viewing for Saturday, February 2nd at 5:30 p.m. That afternoon, Lindsay and Jason had a late lunch together before leaving in separate vehicles. Lindsay is believed to have gone home to change, while Jason stopped at an automobile repair shop to pick up a colleague. He was running late, and Lindsay knew he wouldn't reach the property before the appointment began. The house was located at 1702 D'Souza Place in Sarnish, a small cul-de-sac containing only 4 houses. At around 5:30 p.m., 2 people were seen walking toward the property. One was a tall, dark-haired man, and the other was a blonde woman wearing a noticeably patterned dress. This was already different from what Lindsay had been told, because the woman on the phone had said she would be coming alone. Witnesses watched Lindsay greet the couple outside and shake their hands before leading them into the house. From the way she interacted with them, it appeared that she was meeting them for the first time. The 3 then disappeared inside the empty property, and from that point on, there were no witnesses to what happened during the showing. Jason arrived at the cul-de-sac at around 5:40 p.m. with his colleague. As they approached, he later said he could see a figure through the glass of the front door. He waited outside for several minutes before moving his vehicle to a nearby street so he wouldn't interfere with Lindsay's appointment. After waiting a little longer, Jason texted Lindsay to make sure everything was okay. She never opened the message. He eventually returned to the house and tried the front door, but it was locked. Through the glass, he could see Lindsay's shoes inside the entrance hall, but no one answered when he repeatedly knocked. Jason called 911 while his colleague went around the property looking for another way inside. In the backyard, he discovered that the patio door had been left wide open. The 2 men entered the house, and Jason's colleague moved through the main floor to unlock the front door for him. Jason immediately ran upstairs. In the master bedroom, he found Lindsay lying on the floor in a pool of blood. He called 911 again, and emergency responders arrived soon afterward. But Lindsay was pronounced dead at the scene. She had been stabbed multiple times, and investigators found no defensive wounds, suggesting she may have been attacked before she had any chance to react. Nothing had been stolen from her, and there was no evidence of sexual assault. The man and woman Lindsay had met outside the house were nowhere to be found. By the time Jason entered the property, the back patio door was standing open, and the couple who had arranged the showing had disappeared. In the days after Lindsay's murder, investigators began trying to reconstruct how the couple had arrived at the house and where they went afterward. Jason and his colleague were initially taken into custody, but both were released after their accounts were checked. Surveillance footage from the automobile shop also confirmed Jason's whereabouts shortly before the murder, and police have said that he continued to cooperate with investigators in the years that followed. Attention then turned to the unidentified man and woman who had entered the house with Lindsay. Police found no useful DNA, fingerprints, or other physical evidence at the scene. Nothing had been stolen, and the couple had apparently left without being seen. investigators began to believe that whoever killed Lindsay had planned the encounter carefully. One possibility was that the killers had been preparing to leave through the front of the house when Jason arrived outside. After noticing him, they may have changed their route and escaped through the rear patio door instead. From there, they could have passed through the backyard fence and reached a vehicle parked somewhere along Torquay Drive. It would also explain why witnesses had seen the couple walking into the cul-de-sac rather than arriving in a car. But one of the strongest indications of planning came from the phone used to arrange the showing. Investigators discovered that it had been purchased in Vancouver months earlier and had never been used before contacting Lindsay. It was activated under the name Paulo Rodriguez, which authorities determined was fake, and the address attached to it belonged to an unrelated business. Cell tower records showed that the phone travelled from Vancouver to Vancouver Island by ferry the day before Lindsay was killed. After the murder, it was deactivated and never used again. Investigators eventually learned that there was also a second phone connected to the first, which had been used to check its voicemail. Whoever had arranged the appointment appeared to have created a communication trail specifically for Lindsay, and then abandoned it once she was dead. Police now had a murder that appeared to have been arranged around Lindsay's work. The killers knew how to reach her directly, gave her a reason to meet them inside an empty house, and selected a situation where being alone with strangers wouldn't immediately seem unusual. Yet despite all of that preparation, investigators still had no clear answer for why anyone would want Lindsay dead. One theory emerged from events that had taken place shortly before her murder. In December 2007, Lindsay had attempted to contact a friend of an ex-boyfriend while visiting Calgary. Several weeks later, that man was arrested during a major drug investigation in Alberta. This led to speculation that someone may have mistakenly believed Lindsay had provided information to police. Investigators looked into that possibility, but found that Lindsay had not been a police informant. Some investigators also felt that the way she had been killed didn't resemble a professional contract murder. Instead, they believed the attack appeared personal, and that whoever planned it may have known enough about Lindsay's life and work to create an appointment she would agree to attend. Other connections were examined as well, including people around Lindsay and Jason, and individuals linked to the real estate business. Jason's family was investigated partly because they had connections to the area where Lindsay was killed, but police have publicly stated that no member of the Zeiler family is considered a suspect. As the years passed, investigators continued examining the case without identifying the couple seen entering the house. New information occasionally surfaced, including details about unusual internet activity involving Lindsay before her death. In 2021, Saanich police announced that advances in DNA analysis and other technology had generated new leads, but the central questions have never changed. Someone knew enough about Lindsay to contact her directly. They created a false identity, arranged a legitimate-looking real estate appointment, traveled to the area, and met her at an empty house at exactly the time they had arranged. Then, within a short period of time, Lindsay was dead and the couple was gone. More than 18 years later, the murder of Lindsay Buziak remains unsolved, and the identities of the man and woman who walked into that house with her have never been publicly established. In October 2009, Bobby and Sherilyn Jameson were living with their 6-year-old daughter Madison in Eufaula, Oklahoma. The family had recently been considering a move and were interested in purchasing a large piece of land near the small town of Red Oak, about 30 miles away. They were looking at roughly 40 acres in a remote, heavily wooded part of southeastern Oklahoma. On October 8th, Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison prepared to leave home to visit the property. Their home surveillance system recorded Bobby and Sherilyn making several trips between the house and their pickup truck as they packed. They barely spoke to one another and moved slowly and methodically, behavior that would later be described as almost trance-like. At one point, Sherilyn was also recorded placing a brown briefcase inside the truck. Once they finished packing, the family left Eufaula with their dog, Maisie, and drove toward the mountains of Latimer County. The area they were heading into was rural and sparsely populated, with long stretches of wooded roads running through the hills. They were apparently there to look at land they might eventually purchase and build on. At some point, after arriving in the area, the Jamesons disappeared. Several days later, their pickup truck was discovered abandoned in a remote area south of Kinta. There was no sign of Bobby, Sherilyn, or Madison anywhere around it. But their dog, Maisie, was still inside the vehicle and had become severely malnourished. When investigators searched the truck, they found something even harder to explain. The family's identification cards and wallets were still there, along with their cell phones and GPS system. Investigators also discovered approximately $32,000 in cash inside the vehicle, despite the Jamesons not being known to routinely carry that kind of money. Nothing about the truck immediately explained why all three members of the family had walked away from it. They had left behind their phones, identification, money, and a dog they apparently expected to return to. Search teams began combing the surrounding wilderness, trying to determine where the family could have gone after leaving the vehicle. Investigators also returned to the surveillance footage from the Jameson home. The unusual way Bobby and Sherilyn had packed became one of the details that attracted attention, along with the brown briefcase Sherilyn had carried to the truck. Despite being visible in the footage, that briefcase was not found with the family's other belongings. Sherilyn also owned a handgun. That was missing as well. Searches continued through the rugged terrain surrounding the abandoned truck, but there was no immediate sign of the family. 3 people had driven into the mountains together, apparently to look at property, and somehow all 3 had vanished while leaving almost everything important behind. For the next 4 years, no one knew where Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jameson had gone. For weeks after the Jamesons disappeared, search teams worked through the remote terrain surrounding their abandoned truck. The area was heavily wooded and difficult to cover, but despite extensive searches, there was no sign of Bobby, Sherilyn, or Madison. With almost everything they would normally need still sitting inside their vehicle, investigators struggled to explain why the entire family had left it behind. As the case remained unsolved, several theories began to develop. One centered on the $32,000 found inside the truck. Because the Jamesons weren't known for carrying that much cash, investigators considered whether they could have been involved with drugs or had arranged to meet someone in the area. Their unusual behavior on the surveillance footage only added to the speculation, but no evidence ever established that Bobby or Sherilyn were drug dealers. Investigators also looked into problems within the family's personal life. Before disappearing, Bobby had been involved in a bitter legal dispute with his father, Bob Dean Jameson. Bobby claimed that his father had threatened his family and had even struck him with a vehicle the previous year. Police investigated that connection, but ultimately said they did not believe Bobby's father was involved in the disappearance. Other details made the case even more difficult to understand. Bobby and Sherilyn had reportedly spoken separately with their pastor about believing there were spirits inside their home. Bobby was also alleged to have been reading from the Satanic Bible. These details generated years of speculation around the case, but none provided investigators with an explanation for what happened after the family reached the mountains. With no bodies and little physical evidence, theories ranged from the family intentionally disappearing to murder or some kind of group suicide. But the truck continued to complicate almost every explanation. Their identification, phones, GPS, dog, and thousands of dollars in cash had all been left behind, while the brown briefcase seen on their surveillance footage and Sherilyn's handgun were missing. Then, in November 2013, more than 4 years after the family disappeared, 2 hunters were walking through a remote part of Latimer County. Less than 3 miles from where the Jamesons' truck had been abandoned, they discovered skeletal human remains. There were 3 sets in total, 2 adults and 1 child. Because of the condition of the remains, investigators couldn't immediately confirm who they were. Anthropological and forensic testing continued for months. Then, on July 3rd, 2014, officials announced that the remains belonged to Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison. Finding the family answered the question of where they had gone, but almost nothing else. The remains were so heavily decomposed that the medical examiner was unable to determine a cause of death. There was still no clear explanation for why the Jamisons had left their truck, why they had walked into the wilderness, or whether someone else had been with them. The missing handgun and brown briefcase never provided the answer investigators had hoped for either. And despite the theories that accumulated around the family over the years, none has been proven to explain their deaths. What is known is that Bobby, Sherilyn, and 6-year-old Madison drove into the mountains of southeastern Oklahoma in October 2009, apparently while looking at land they were considering buying. Their truck was found abandoned with nearly everything still inside. 4 years later, all three were found less than 3 miles away, and to this day, no one knows what happened to the Jamison family after they left that truck. In the summer of 2002, 22-year-old Jennifer Servo had just graduated from the University of Montana with a degree in journalism. She had grown up in Columbia Falls, Montana, and had already worked at a local television station while beginning her career. Jennifer wanted to eventually work for a major news network, but first, she needed a full-time reporting job. That opportunity took her more than 1,000 miles away to Abilene, Texas. In August, Jennifer accepted a position as a reporter at KRBC-TV and moved into an apartment in the city. It was her first full-time job in television news, and she had only been living in Abilene for about a month when September arrived. On Sunday, September 15th, Jennifer finished work at around 11:30 p.m. Afterward, she went shopping with Brian Travers, a co-worker at the station, whom she had briefly been romantically involved with. They left the store at around 12:30 a.m. Brian would later tell investigators that while they were out that night, he believed another vehicle had been following them. Sometime between 12:30 a.m. and 1:39 a.m., Jennifer returned to her apartment alone. At 1:39 a.m., she spoke with a friend on the phone. Nothing from that conversation indicated that something was wrong. It would become the last known contact with Jennifer before she was killed. When Jennifer failed to show up for work, her co-workers became concerned. This was unusual enough that eventually someone went to her apartment to check on her. 2 days had now passed since anyone at the station had seen her. Inside the apartment, Jennifer was found fully clothed and slumped face down over the bathtub. She was pronounced dead later that afternoon. Investigators determined that she had been killed on September 16th, shortly after returning home. Jennifer had suffered blunt force trauma and had also been strangled. Investigators believed the attack most likely began in the living room, where Jennifer's bed was located. Blood marks led from that area toward the bathroom, indicating that her body had been moved after she was attacked. But there was something else investigators immediately noticed about the apartment. There were no signs that anyone had forced their way inside. Jennifer had been cautious since moving to an unfamiliar city. According to one of her friends, she wouldn't normally open her door for a stranger, and she had even rented a local P.O. box so she wouldn't have mail delivered directly to her apartment. Yet whoever entered that night appeared to have gotten inside without breaking in. There was also no evidence that Jennifer had been sexually assaulted, and investigators couldn't immediately identify an obvious reason someone would have wanted to kill her. She had only been living in Abilene for a matter of weeks. Police began collecting DNA from people close to Jennifer and examining the relationships she had formed before and after moving to Texas. They also learned that a neighbor had previously heard Jennifer arguing with someone inside her apartment, and investigators still had one detail from the final hours of Jennifer's life that they couldn't simply ignore. According to the co-worker who had been with her that night, someone may have been following them only hours before Jennifer returned home and was killed. As investigators began looking into Jennifer's life, they focused on the people who had been closest to her during her short time in Abilene. DNA samples were collected from 6 people, and police examined her relationships for anyone who might have had a reason to hurt her. With no obvious signs of forced entry, one possibility was that Jennifer had willingly allowed her killer into the apartment. One of the first people investigators looked at was Jennifer's former boyfriend, Ralph Sepulveda. The two had met while serving in the Army Reserves in Montana and eventually lived together in Abilene. Their relationship didn't last long. Jennifer discovered that Ralph had previously been engaged to another woman and had a child from that relationship, and the two separated. Ralph moved into another apartment in Abilene, but according to one of Jennifer's friends, he later asked Jennifer if they could begin dating again. Jennifer declined. Investigators questioned him after the murder, and he told police that he had been home that night and had fallen asleep at around 10:30 p.m. For a time, investigators considered Ralph seriously enough that they believed there might be a case against him, but ultimately, he was cleared without being charged. No evidence has publicly established that he was responsible for Jennifer's death. Police also examined Brian Travers, Jennifer's co-worker at KRBC. Brian and Jennifer had briefly been romantically involved, and he had been with her only hours before she was killed. The two had left work at around 11:30 p.m. on September 15th and gone shopping together before separating later that night. Brian cooperated with investigators and provided his DNA. Police eventually cleared him as well, but his account of their shopping trip left investigators with another unanswered question. Brian said that while he and Jennifer were out, he noticed a vehicle following them. Whether that vehicle had anything to do with Jennifer's murder has never been established. Investigators continued looking for other clues inside and around Jennifer's apartment. A neighbor reported having previously heard Jennifer arguing with someone inside, although there was no clear indication of who that person had been. There were also reports that after Jennifer's death, someone used her college library card to check out books. What books were taken, and whether the incident had any connection to her murder, has never been publicly explained. Years passed without an arrest. New leads were periodically investigated, and advances in forensic technology eventually gave detectives another opportunity to examine evidence collected in 2002. In the 2020s, old evidence from the case was sent to private laboratories for additional DNA testing, but the basic circumstances of Jennifer's final night remain unresolved. She had been living in Abilene for only about a month. She returned to her apartment sometime after midnight, spoke with a friend at 1:39 a.m., and was killed sometime afterward. There were no signs of forced entry, and the two men investigators publicly examined were both eventually cleared. More than 2 decades later, no one has been arrested for Jennifer's murder. Investigators still don't know whether the person reportedly following Jennifer that night was connected to what happened, whether her killer was someone she already knew, or why she was targeted in the first place. Jennifer had moved to Texas to begin the career she had spent years working toward. Less than a month later, she was killed inside her new apartment, and the identity of the person who entered that apartment that night remains unknown. Alright guys, that will be it for today. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss next week's upload. I drop new stories every week, so there's always something coming. I'll see you in the next one.